Josh Blank from the UT Politics Project. Thank you so much for joining us. You're out with a new poll that shows Republicans with a double-digit leads in at least the top, all of the top statewide races. So let's talk a little bit about the governor's race.
Sure. The governor's lead appears to be widening in a race that, he's really led from the start. And I think, the way to look at this is that there have been advantages that have been accruing to the Republican Party over the course of this election cycle, and they're really just starting to kind of combine at just the right time. Uh, you know, Evaluations and concerns of the economy are central to voters right now, and their evaluation of the president, Joe Biden, a Democrat, is very negative on both these fronts, on both inflation in particular and on the economy. Immigration remains a central concern for a large number of voters. And on these two key issues, Texans' ratings of the president and in turn the president's party are very negative.
And I mean, we always knew that this was going to be a tough year for Democrats. Democrats themselves knew going in, even last year, that this was going to be a tough year for them. And so I'm wondering, there was all this talk once the Supreme Court basically overturned Roe v. Wade that this is the Democrats' chance. Has that essentially evaporated?
I don't know if it's evaporated so much as it was never really there. I think the reality is that the Dobbs decision came at the beginning of a summer in which, the easing of gas prices and some Democratic legislative achievements at the national level really, I think, gave the Democrats both, nationally and in Texas, a little bit of a break. Within the abortion issue in particular, I think what you'd find is that most voters know what they think about abortion and vote accordingly. And so the reality is that it is as seismic of a shift as the Dobbs decision and Texas's subsequent prohibition on abortion has been. For most people, they've been voting, with their abortion politics all along, and this just becomes incorporated into environment that really means that the chance for a seismic shift is really limited when you kind of consider it that way.
And so I wanted to ask about, because one thing about in the governor's race, here you have a candidate, Beto O'Rourke, on the Democratic side, who has been able to match Governor Abbott fundraising wise, even come in a little above the governor. He attracts very large crowds in rural areas even. And so I'm wondering, the fact that this is an 11 percentage point race, what does that say about O'Rourke himself, and what does it say about just the Democratic Party in Texas?
I think there are two ways to interpret this, or maybe more. But I'll say this: for O'Rourke, when he ran first in 2018, really the wind was at it, was filling his sails. He was largely unknown and viewed largely positively. Ted Cruz mostly ignored him for a large portion of that campaign, which allowed him to generate a lot of really good and positive coverage. And that was in an election year in which Democrats were mobilized. It was Donald Trump's first midterm election year. And all those things really accrued to help, propel O'Rourke, who himself, is certainly a quality candidate, his ability to raise money, to rally people, to excite people, to a very, very close election. Ultimately, what we're looking at in 2022 is a very, very different environment. And O'Rourke is no longer viewed universally positively. He's viewed overwhelmingly negatively by Republicans. He's viewed negatively by independents. And among key groups that he would need to be more successful in this election, namely, Hispanic voters and voters in the suburbs, he's having a hard time really making a big dent in kind of the status quo.
And he's a polarizing figure, is he not?
I think in today's politics, anyone who is known to more than half the public is a polarizing figure. It's pretty hard for someone to be in the public's arena making statements about issues of importance to people and not in the current environment be polarizing. And so O'Rourke is no different in that sense.
And, I wanted to ask, as far as, the onus was on him and the other Democrats running statewide to, force people to realize, hey, we need to make a change here. And why do you think that didn't happen? Is it because of, inflation concerns, border concerns really weighing heavily on that? And is it also the fact that the Texas economy, despite everything else going on nationally, still outperforms, the other states?
Well, I think that's part of it. I think ultimately the national storyline has won out over the local storyline, and I think you see that all over the poll in a lot of ways. People's attitudes towards the economy, both nationally and in Texas, are some of the most negative evaluations we've ever seen. Their attitudes towards their own sort of personal economic situation are some of the most negative attitudes that we've seen in the lifespan of the poll going back to 2008. Um, but at the same time, you have two candidates in Abbott and O'Rourke who voters generally view relatively ambivalently. It's not as though Abbott has overwhelming job approval or voters view him overwhelmingly favorably. Ultimately, both Abbott and O'Rourke have essentially, split responses to them from the electorate. And so what you find is that, the national agenda, given, the consistency of it and really the centrality of it to voters, especially the economy, and in Texas, the immigration border security issue, is winning out, when we also find in the same exact poll that gives Craig Abbott an 11-point lead over Beto O'Rourke that 55% want to see gun control laws made more strict in Texas, that a majority want to see the abortion laws in the state made less strict. And so on some of these big key policy areas that Democrats are pushing, voters on the whole are actually with them. The issue is that Democrats are just have and continue to have a hard time mobilizing those voters at the same rates as Republicans in a state where there tend to be more Republican voters than Democratic voters.
Does it surprise you that in a lot of these polls, people still trust the governor more so than Beto O'Rourke to handle some of these big issues, even on guns, even on abortion, the economy, the border, et cetera?
Not at all. Look, more than half the state electorate is Republican because Republicans have won every statewide election for the last 20 years. And when you look at the governor's handling of all these issues and you look at attitudes among Republicans, his job approval ratings are through the roof. And so as far as the governor is concerned and the governing majority in the state, they are happy with the trajectory of the gun laws, of the abortion laws, and of the way the state has handled itself in the state's business. And so, what that accrues to is a slight, I think, endorsement of the status quo, and the point which is more trust for Abbott than O'Rourke, basically across every issue that we tested, except for the environment. But I think what that shows is that, Texans are saying, okay, we're okay staying with the status quo because the majority of voters are pretty happy with it.
Wanted to ask about the lieutenant governor's race. It shows that two-term incumbent Dan Patrick has a 15 percentage point lead over Mike Collier. This is a rematch from 2018. Mike Collier really tried to make a go of it and continues to press about fixing the grid. What do you make of his focus on that, given all these other issues?
Well, I think, to me, the focus of Mike Collier on the grid, but Democrats more generally on the grid, it's a symbolic issue in a lot of ways. I mean, back in February of 2021, it was a very real issue. It wasn't symbolic for anybody living in Texas. But at this point, it's become a symbol of mismanagement, of, basically whether or not voters should trust the incumbent government with the handling of the basic functions, right? Like, basically making sure that the electricity stays on and the water comes through the pipes. And, I think in an environment that is very negative generally, in terms of thinking about the trajectory of the state, the trajectory of the country, all these other things we've been talking about, negative economic evaluations, I think the goal of a candidate like Collier was to saddle Patrick and in turn Republicans with these failures. The issue is that it just hasn't worked, as that issue has receded from the front of voters' minds. And more prescient concerns like inflation have really, in the border, in many cases, have really come to the forefront.
And as far as Patrick going and having a bus tour throughout rural areas in Texas, what do you make of that strategy? Smart?
You know, I've been watching elections in Texas for a fair amount of time now, and the thing that I've noticed about this election is that it feels like a pretty normal Texas election in a lot of ways. Given the fact that, and part of that is just saying that, it's not as though we're seeing dramatic shifts in the electorate that would make you think this is going to be something different or off the trend line or unusual when we look back at it. And I think that's reflected in the lieutenant governor's choice of a leisurely bus tour through rural Texas without a ton of, press coverage. Is that ultimately what that tells me is that he's been looking at this race and thinks that it's pretty comfortable. And it's not like he's necessarily looking to extend himself or go into enemy territory to win the race, because I don't think he feels like he needs to.
And wanted to ask you about the Attorney General's race, because your poll shows Paxton, the two-term incumbent, 14 percentage points ahead of Democrat Rochelle Garza. And obviously a lot was made in a very nasty primary fight where Paxton had three Republicans, all with statewide name recognition among Republicans. And he survived that and is still surviving this pretty handily, despite all of his legal baggage. What do you make of this?
Well, a couple things. I mean, first, I'd say, Ken Paxton has done a really, remarkable job of solidifying himself and his brand within the Republican Party in Texas. And he, was really one of, President Trump's biggest defenders, even before, I think other Republicans were really kind of falling over themselves to be one of his biggest defenders. And that's, I think, ingratiated Paxton to the Republican electorate. It's important to remember also that, Justin Nelson ran a really spirited campaign in 2018 in a much better electoral environment for Democrats, focused solely on the issue of Ken Paxton's indictment. He came very close in that election. But the other thing I point out is a lot of Republicans still voted for Ken Paxton after that campaign. And so what I'd say is I think maybe the continued power of that issue might be dwindling unless there's a dramatic, advancement in any of those legal cases, because voters have already voted for Ken Paxton while he was under indictment, and they have reelected him. And for Rochelle Garza, she faces the same challenge that all Democrats face in Texas, which is that she started this race completely unknown to the electorate. I think she's in the polling showed she's made some pretty good progress. But ultimately, like all Democrats in Texas, it's a very big state. It's very expensive to campaign in, and it's really hard to break through and be known to enough of the right kind of people with the right degree of enthusiasm to really shake, I think the overall fundamentals of the race, which are giving Republicans a pretty comfortable lead right now.
And Paxton has not done any interviews with any Texas media, but in his public rallies and in his public comments, he has really made fighting back against federal government and Biden administration overreach the central part of his campaign. And obviously that seems to be working for him, no?
Yeah, and it's not really even his strategy to begin with. I mean, our current governor really, made his place as attorney general with the line that, he wakes up in the morning, goes to the office, sues the Obama administration, and goes back home. I think, Ken Paxton is following a very successful playbook for Republican attorneys general to, sue and try to thwart incumbent Democratic administrations at every turn, just as Democratic attorney generals look to do the same during Republican administrations. It seems to be a pretty successful strategy to keep oneself, in, especially really any attorney general. It's a very successful strategy for any attorney general, really, to keep themselves in the public spotlight on their terms.
Joshua Blank from the UT Politics Project, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate all of your insight.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.